Welcome, everyone. If this is your first program for the new year with us at Village Preservation, I'm wishing you a very, very happy new year, and I hope you've had a great start to 2026. My name is William Roca. I am the Director of Programs here at Village Preservation. We're so glad for you to join us for this evening's program, Architectural and Cultural Highlights of the Greenwich Village Historic District. Now, before I introduce our esteemed guest for this evening, if this is the first program you're ever joining with Village Preservation, just give me a few minutes to tell you a little bit about us. Village Preservation was founded back in 1980, and we work to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've helped secure landmark designation for more than 1,300 buildings in our neighborhoods and more than 80 free programs each year. Just like this, in person, virtual, you name it, we have probably done some version of it. But we are a members-based organization, so your support is absolutely critical to the work that we do. So if you could take a moment, scan that QR code that you see there on your screen, and consider becoming a member of Village Preservation, or perhaps giving us a little donation would also, any bit of help would be great. But if you're just first want to learn a little bit more about village preservation, head over to villagepreservation.org, learn about the advocacy work that we do, learn more about all the other programs that we host. But I also highly recommend, and you're going to learn a lot more about it this evening, to learn more about some of the digital resources we have. Now, we have an array of awesome virtual maps, one of which you're going to learn about this evening, but we also have an incredible image archive of over 5,000 images donated by supporters of village preservation documenting life in the village across the decades. And we also have an incredible collection of oral history and learning about the life and times of people who have lived here in our neighborhoods and the incredible things that they have accomplished. So please go to villagepreservation.org, learn a little bit more about what we do, and all these free resources are available for you to use whether you decide to become a member or not at this time. Now, as I mentioned, we host over 80 free programs a year. Here are the next upcoming programs here in January. So tomorrow evening, we have Walk Her Way New York City, a walking guide to women's history. So if you're interested in doing that, that is a virtual program. You can go to villagepreservation.org/events and register for that. And then on the Tuesday, the 27th of January, we have 60 years of landmark designations, has a golden age of preservation in New York City ended. This is also a virtual program, so you'll be able to enjoy both of these programs from the comfort of your own home. Now, before I introduce our guest for this evening, just some quick logistics. We are on Zoom, so you, as an attendee, your camera will be off and you will be muted throughout. But this does not mean we don't want to have you interact. If you have a question at any point this evening, you can go ahead and pop that into the chat or into the Q&A feature, and then we'll ask those questions at the end of this evening's program. But now, without further ado, I am going to introduce Dena Tasse-Winter. She spearheaded our efforts to relaunch the new and improved Greenwich Village Historic District virtual map and tours. She's a historic preservationist, writer, and Village Preservation's own director of research and preservation. She's a native New Yorker and a Greenwich Village resident. She holds an MA in Historic Preservation and Cultural Heritage Management from the University of York in the UK and a BA in Music History from the University of Rochester. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Dena, I'm going to hand it over to you. I will vanish into the shadows, but I am here if you need me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, William. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. As William mentioned, I'm Village Preservation's Director of Research and Preservation. And I was so pleased to get to work on this incredible virtual map resource, along with several of our colleagues, which I will introduce to you today. The map, not the colleagues, though they're also in the background helping out. So let me go ahead and share my screen now. All right, so I do have a slide deck that I will go through with some highlights from this map, but I wanted to start out by just introducing you all to the format of the map, because that was really an integral part of this project. So if you've been following along with village preservation and engaged with us and our resources for some time, you may have already heard this, but if not, or as a refresher, I will just let you all know that back in 2019, for the 50th anniversary of the designation of the Greenwich Village Historic District, Village Preservation set out to document the current status of every single building in the Greenwich Village Historic District, which, as you can see here, there are approximately 2,200 buildings over 100 blocks. So it was kind of a monumental feat to document all of them. And we set out to do that so that we could have a then and now comparison of the buildings at the time of designation in the late 1960s and how they appeared in 2019. And by virtue of being a historic district, it turned out that most of the buildings had not changed substantially. As we were expecting, the buildings receive the benefit of being protected as part of the historic district. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that no change is allowed, and there actually are several new buildings that have been constructed in the intervening years and various modifications to buildings, but by and large, we saw a lot of similarities between the photographs. And so it was sort of a blessing in disguise in the past year or two when we learned that the web program that hosts this map was being kind of upgraded, which inadvertently meant that we needed to manually upgrade our map to be kind of evergreen for the future. So all of that background to say, myself, along with Chloe, our research associate, and a few other people were involved in overhauling the original version of our 2019 map, and along the way getting to update some of the content, really flesh out some of our tours with even more information, and make sure that the then and now photos, that we had one of every single building. And so if I do say so myself, this I think is our really beautiful result. So the map has, as I said, then and now photos of every building in the district. And then we've got about 24 thematic tours, which, as you can see here, feature all different types of layers of history, from architectural to cultural. And I'm pleased to this evening take you on sort of a whirlwind highlights tour of many of these tours, so you can get a taste of what is held within this map. And then I very much encourage you to explore it on your own and pick out which topics you're most interested in. And if there's time at the end, I'll get more into the then and now photos to give you more of a flavor of that. But just very quickly right now, so you can see the building footprint of every single building, and you can click on any of them to see those then and now photographs that I was talking about. And so if you live in the village and you want to see what your building looked like in the 60s versus today, you can do that. Or if you're a visitor, whether in person or just virtually, and you want to explore certain buildings, you can click on any of them and learn all about their architectural history. But for now, I'm going to flip over to my presentation here and take you on my highlights tour. So let me see if I can just make this full screen here to make it easiest for everyone to see. Great, so let's dig right in. So I'm gonna go through, as I said, there are 24 different thematic tours. I'm gonna touch on most of them tonight in kind of a rapid fire fashion so that I can share as much of diversity of these layers of history as possible to give you a flavor of what you can find within the map. So starting with course of history change, I thought that would be a great place to start because, well, really many of these sites can be thought of as places where the course of history changed in small ways, in bigger ways. But we just took a selection of kind of what we thought of as the most pivotal or moments in history in these places that really shifted the trajectory of Greenwich Village history, of American history, sometimes of global history. And so it kind of runs the gamut of a lot of different types of activities, but I'm just going to highlight a few of them to get us started. So I wanted to start with this story about the end of vehicular traffic through Washington Square Park. To me, it's kind of a lovely place to start because it ties into the earliest days of the historic preservation movement in Greenwich Village and in New York City. So as a preservationist and as the director of preservation for village preservation, it really ties into a lot of facets of what I do and what we do. So as you can see throughout this presentation, you'll see often screenshots from the different tours on the map. So this is kind of what it'll look like when you go through on your own. And of course, when you're in the interactive digital map, you can click on any of these points and see all the different moments that we're talking about. But I've just screenshot a few of them to share with you. So the backstory here is that vehicular traffic passed through Washington Square Park for decades. That it's kind of foreign for us to think of that now as such an open public space, but for many years, it was open to traffic. It was even a parking lot for a time. And the Fifth Avenue buses used to use the central fountain as their sort of turning point to pivot and turn back up Fifth Avenue. But following World War II, the sort of infamous parks commissioner at the time, Robert Moses, you may know him as the power broker, proposed a Lower Manhattan Expressway that would connect Fifth Avenue to locations south of Washington Square Park. And in order to do so, he wanted to essentially build a highway that just cut right through Washington Square Park. And that became sort of the last straw for a lot of community neighbors. Many of them were mothers or people who had families in the neighborhood who just really had long wanted to have this be a public space and were kind of aghast at the idea that a highway could be built here. So some of the people involved in the effort to preserve the park and close it to traffic for good were names that you may recognize: Jane Jacobs, Shirley Hayes, Claire Tankle, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who all lived nearby. And they ultimately succeeded. And this photograph here is of the last car through Washington Square, which was Claire and her husband Stanley Tankle's car. And so you can read many more details about this if you would like to in our map. But I thought I'd then continue on talking more about Washington Square Park because there's so many layers of history in this park. And so just a few years later, as you can see here in 1961, the Washington Square Association, along with then Parks Commissioner Newbold Morris, chose to act on their belief that the park, so it had been closed to cars, but it had then quickly become kind of a gathering place for musicians and beatniks and people who were, being, in their words, riotous. So the association and the Parks Commissioner wanted the park to become tranquil and not be open to these sorts of protest activities. So the police were ordered to remove the, quote, roving troubadours and their followers, end quote. People like Bob Dylan, who was very young at the time, but was already there in the park playing music with his friends. So on Sunday, April 9th, 1961, what's known as the Beatnik Riot took place, where all of these beatniks occupied the park with their music and voices. Close to 3,000 people were in attendance. And it took several more protests after that and a 1,500 person petition, but ultimately the ban was lifted and the park was more, as we know it today, a gathering place for people to live their lives and play music and protest if they wish to, and kind of do all the things that they should be able to do in a public space. One more layer that I wanted to touch upon in Washington Square Park. Now we got to go back in time to the first free Black settlement in North America, part of which overlapped with Washington Square Park. When New Amsterdam was founded in 1624 at the southern tip of Manhattan, below today's Greenwich Village, just a few years later, in the 1640s, there were 27 enslaved Africans who were granted freedom and given land in an area north of the colony, which came to be known as the Land of the Blacks. And this first settlement ran up kind of the center of the island, including parts of today's Tribeca, Soho, Chinatown, Lower East Side, East Village, and Greenwich Village, including Washington Square Park, what we today know as the park. And then one more, as you can see, there are so many points on the map, but one more I wanted to touch upon along this theme was Jimi Hendrix's Electric Lady Studios, which opened on August 26th, 1970, just 3 weeks before his very unfortunate death. It was the only recording artist-owned studio at that time, and countless musicians have passed through its walls and recorded there since. And that is a nice transition for me to our next theme, because many, though not all, but many of those musicians have also lived in the neighborhood. So I wanted to go on to talk about some of the musicians' homes. And again, there are many, but just starting over on Bank Street, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, though John Lennon is most associated with the Dakota Apartments, he and Yoko lived at 105 Bank Street, which is an 1864 row house from 1971 to 72. And Lennon is known as having really had a deep love of Greenwich Village. And they actually rented their apartment from Joe Butler of the Love and Spoonful. So it's a very musical building. And just next door at 107 Bank Street, a neighboring row house, John Cage, the experimental composer, lived also in the 1970s with his partner, who was the choreographer Merce Cunningham. And the Johns, John Cage and John Lennon, actually got to know each other by being neighbors and became friends. And Cunningham's studio was actually at Westbeth, just 1 block west of here. So it was very convenient for them. And you really can't talk about musicians in Greenwich Village without mentioning Bob Dylan, at least. So I just thought this was a really great photograph of Bob Dylan and Suze Rotolo, his girlfriend at the time, as well as Dave Van Ronk here on the right, all Greenwich Village residents. And as many probably know, in addition to living on West 4th Street, Dylan and Suze did a photo shoot for the cover of his 1963 album, The Free Will and Bob Dylan, on Jones Street, right around the corner. So moving on to our next theme of writers' homes and haunts. Now, this one, I wanted to start by giving you kind of an overview, because as you can see, we've got a ton of points on the map. This is our most prolific of our tours at the moment. We have 153 sites, and believe me, it is not conclusive. There are so many writers who have lived and spent time in Greenwich Village. And one thing that I thought was interesting to note here is that a lot of these creatives tended to move around a lot within the village for different reasons. So like, for example, you can see here that Dawn Powell, we have 4 different known addresses. And then another example is E.B. White lived at 2 different buildings, and Juna Barnes was at 3 different locations within the village. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about Juna, who was perhaps best known because it was her longest residence for living at 5 Patchen Place. She lived here for 42 years until her death in 1982. And she was born in 1892, and had initially moved to Greenwich Village in 1915, but would soon leave for Paris, and then would eventually return to the village in 1941 here to Patchen Place. She was one of the great modernist American writers. She lived a bohemian lifestyle and had a lot of troubles in her life, um, mental health issues, and some of that can perhaps be attributed to her openness about her bisexuality, which was really not something that people were welcoming of at the time. But she had a lot of friends in the village, other famous villagers, such as the photographer Berenice Abbott. And later on in her life, when she was living at Patchen Place, she was known as being a bit of a recluse. And there's sort of a famous story of E. E. Cummings, who lived across the way from her at 4 Patchen Place, would check up on her by shouting out his window, "Are you alive, Juna?" So I thought that was interesting. So that brings us to E. E. Cummings, who was there at 4 Patchen Place. He lived at Patchen Place for 4 decades until his death in 1962. So these two writers living for many, many years in this special little corner of the village. And speaking of that, I just wanted to, again, sort of highlight our then and now photos, and using Patchen Place as a great example. You can see how really not a lot has changed. I think one of the biggest changes that I noticed was the typeface and sort of shape of the street signs that we have from the 60s versus today. That stood out to me. But in terms of the architectural details, everything's pretty intact from the original designation of the historic district until now. One more author I wanted to touch upon was Edna St. Vincent Millay, a very well-known villager. She was a poet and playwright who lived at multiple village addresses, but most famously known for her time at 75.5 Bedford Street, which is this really special little building. You can see it here, the then and now, sort of on the edge of these photographs here, and more prominently on the left. It's known as the narrowest house in the village. And Millay spent many years in the village. She was involved with the Provincetown Players on McDougall Street, as was Juna Barnes. And in 1924, notably, Millay and some of her colleagues founded the Cherry Lane Theatre on Commerce Street, which is still an active theater today. Moving on to artists' homes and haunts, I chose, for the sake of the amount of time we have tonight, to not get into specifics of the artists' homes and haunts, but similarly to the writers, this is quite a massive tour for us. We have 146 points on the tour, and some really incredible artists, from Roy Lichtenstein to Jackson Pollock to Isamu Noguchi to 143 others. So I definitely encourage you to take a closer look to that. And one of them is Edward Hopper, who we also made a separate tour of, and I will now show you why. So Hopper did himself live in the village at 3 Washington Square North for 53 years, really pretty much the entirety of his time as a working artist. He was born in 1882 and lived until 1967, and was one of America's most renowned realist painters. And it's really special that he was in the village, because that realism is reflected in the very real buildings that he based a lot of his work on. So this one here, you can see his painting Roofs, Washington Square, shows kind of a unique perspective that Hopper had by having his studio there and being able to go up onto his roof and understand the village in a way that only a resident could. A few of his really famous works were based upon buildings in the village. It's interesting, though, because he often did not reveal exactly which buildings inspired which paintings, but we and other researchers have been able to sort of hone in on some of them and determine what we think were the buildings inspiring some of his works. So one example is here. Considerable evidence points to his 1927 work Drugstore being inspired by the building at this corner here, 154 West 10th Street. For example, you can see the detail of the slender cast iron column that remains in the building today and is reflected in his work, and is currently occupied by Three Lives Bookstore, which is a very popular bookstore in the neighborhood. I had just accidentally given a slight preview, but thinking about Hopper and Hopper's understanding of architecture in the neighborhood inspired me to next talk a little bit about architectural types and styles found in Greenwich Village. So Greenwich Village is full of tons of mid to late 19th century row houses. These are what we sometimes colloquially call brownstones. They're prominently in the Federal and Greek Revival styles, and that's, like I said, from the kind of mid to late 1800s. But the Greenwich Village Historic District wasn't designated until 1969. And in the 60s, mid-century modern was taking hold in New York and including in the village. So we have a good number of very interesting mid-century modern buildings that made it into the designation of the historic district, built just a few years before the designation. And then on the flip side of that, some of the very oldest buildings in the village are wood frame houses. So a lot of the Federal and Greek Revival style row houses that I mentioned are made of brick, but prior to that, some of them had wood framing. And so here, turning over to mid-century again for a second, this is the very famous 200 West 13th Street, the O'Toole building, designed in 1964 by Albert Ledner for the National Maritime Union. So you can see sort of some maritime elements to the design. Remembered by many, including myself as a native Greenwich Villager, as St. Vincent's. Today, it is occupied by Northwell Health. So it's been a healthcare facility for a number of years now. And then on the right, representing wood frame houses, is 77 Bedford Street, which is believed to be the oldest extant house in Greenwich Village. It was built in 1799 to 1800 in the Federal style. And there were some alterations in the 1830s, and this brickwork that you see was part of the later alteration, but there are elements of the original house still there. And you can't see it very well in this photograph, but right next door, if you can see my mouse, is 75.5 Bedford Street, which, as I had just mentioned, was Edna St. Vincent Millay's home for a time. Next, I wanted to briefly touch upon theaters and music venues. So as I'm sure you know, the village has long been home to tons of not only homes of great writers, musicians, and artists, but the places that they would perform their work. So there's a rich off-Broadway and experimental theater history in the village. I had already briefly mentioned the Cherry Lane Theater seen here, which Millay and a few others founded together in the 1920s. And there are many other theaters that similarly represented experimentation in theater history. And then in terms of music venues, there are a ton, especially for jazz, such as Village Vanguard here, Smalls, a few others. It was also a place of many folk music venues, also the aforementioned Electric Lady Studio, and even Washington Square Park itself as a place for performance. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about churches, another important type of building found in the neighborhood. So let's get into it a little bit. Some of you perhaps maybe attended my lecture maybe a year-ish ago now about the history of Lower Fifth Avenue. We have another really great map about that history. We published it celebrating Fifth Avenue's bicentennial, which was kind of at the end of 2024. So I guess technically 2 years ago now. Is when the first stretch in 1824 is when the first stretch of Lower Fifth Avenue opened. And the lower portion of it is within the Greenwich Village Historic District, as you can see here. So we have two really beautiful churches that are part of that history. So this is Church of the Ascension at 36 to 38 Fifth Avenue. It's a Gothic revival style, very classically Gothic revival looking church built in 1840 to 41 by Richard Upjohn, who was an architect who designed many of the Gothic revival churches, including Trinity Church, a little bit further south of our neighborhood. And then just up the street is the First Presbyterian Church at 48 Fifth Avenue, another Gothic revival structure just a few years later, 1844 to 46, by Joseph C. Wells, who was a co-founder of the American Institute of Architects. So really important architects working on these buildings. Another one I wanted to show is St. Joseph Church here, in part because, as you can see, it's of a very different style than the Gothic revival churches we were just looking at. So this one is of the Greek revival style, and it was also built a few years earlier in 1834 to a design by John Doran. And if you especially note the two very prominent Doric columns here that really represent the Greek revival style. And it's also notable as the oldest extant intact Catholic church in Manhattan. So we have a lot of firsts and oldests in Greenwich Village. One more church that I wanted to touch upon tonight is the Metropolitan Duane Methodist Church on 7th Avenue. This one is also Gothic in its style. However, it wasn't built until 1931, pretty late for churches in Greenwich Village, but the reason being that it replaced a prior structure that had burned down. This building is also really important for its social history. It held the first meeting of what would become PFLAG, or Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, in 1973. And 40 years later, in 2013, Village Preservation, that is, we collaborated with the church and with PFLAG to place a plaque commemorating this important moment in LGBTQ plus history. So speaking of that, that's my smooth transition into our next theme, LGBTQ plus sites. So Stonewall, seen here, is of course critically important in the trajectory of LGBTQ rights in our nation. But I wanted to also focus on a few perhaps lesser known or just other stories because there's so much LGBTQ plus heritage in Greenwich Village. So first up is the Oscar Wilde Bookshop. This is its second location here at 15 Christopher Street, but it first opened in 1967, also in the village at 291 Mercer Street. And it's possibly the very first gay bookstore in the world. It ultimately, after a while, it moved to this 15 Christopher location and ultimately closed out of this second location in 2009. So it had a really long history, and there was a lot of upset when it closed. It was really a beloved institution of the neighborhood. And in addition to being a safe space for people to explore the writing of gay people and allies, it was this location, 15 Christopher Street, was where meetings were organized for the first Pride March where organizing meetings about the first Pride March happened following the Stonewall Uprising in 1969. And then I also wanted to mention Julius Bar, which is the site of some really important LGBTQ plus advocacy efforts that occurred prior to Stonewall. So though Stonewall is thought of as a turning point for a very good reason, there were earlier occurrences throughout the neighborhood, including the sip-in that took place here. But this building actually has a much longer history than that. It's one of the older buildings in the village. It dates to 1826, and it originally housed a dry goods business. By 1864, it had become a bar, and it's actually continuously operated ever since, even being a speakeasy during Prohibition, so that it never technically closed as a bar, which makes it one of New York City's oldest surviving continuously operating bars. By the 1950s, it had become a popular spot for gay men, And on April 21st, 1966, the sip-in took place, which was a challenge to the discriminatory state liquor authority rules that at the time stated that people identifying as homosexuals could not be served liquor. So the men seen in this photograph partook in a sip-in, which was one of the instigating occurrences that led to the modern gay rights movement. There are also a number of famous gay people and gay activists who lived in our neighborhood, James Baldwin being one of them at 81 Horatio Street. He lived here from 1958 to 1963. And as is the case for so many of the creatives and people who have called Greenwich Village their home, there's often kind of intersectionality to it. James Baldwin, touched on issues of racial, sexual, and class tension based on his own life as a gay African-American person. And so that leads me into, I just really like this photo of Baldwin, so I used it twice, leads me into some of the Black history in the neighborhood. So much like many of the other layers we've already discussed and will discuss, there's a many years long rich history of Black culture in Greenwich Village. And so I'm just going to touch upon a few of these now. So we're back in Washington Square Park to add a little bit more to the story that I was telling at the beginning of this about that first quote, land of the Blacks. So this gets into some more detail. On September 5th, 1645, Anthony Portuguese was granted a 12-acre parcel of land by the Council of New Amsterdam. And it spanned present-day LaGuardia Place, Thompson Street, and Sullivan Street. And it extended north to encompass much of what we know to be Washington Square Park today. Also in Washington Square Park, so many things have happened there, is, upsettingly, but probably unsurprisingly, there are darker layers of this history here too, as is true for our country. So on July 9th, 1819, so, decade and a half after the quote, land of the Blacks was located here, Rose Butler was a 19-year-old enslaved Black woman who was executed in the Potter's Field, which preceded Washington Square Park in this location. She was actually the last known person to be executed by hanging in the Potter's Field, as demographic changes in the area, as you heard me mention, just a few years later, Fifth Avenue would be open. A lot of these early row houses and mansions were coming in. Those demographic shifts caused the use of this field as an execution ground to fall out of favor and really kind of instigated the push to instead turn it into a public park. And actually, fun fact, the bicentennial of Washington Square Park being opened as a public space, as a park, is taking place 2 days from now. It was January 16th, 1826 that the park opened. So that's a fun, timely fact. A little bit more on Black history in the neighborhood. Similarly to other themes we've talked about, many people with this heritage lived in the neighborhood. And I just specifically chose to talk about this one residence for a few reasons. So Sarah Smith Garnett, she lived here with her husband, the abolitionist and minister Henry Highland Garnett. And Sarah was herself an abolitionist and a suffragist and an educator. The Reverend Dr. Henry Highland Garnett was important for several reasons, including that he became the very first African-American to address the US House of Representatives on February 12th, 1865. Sarah also had a hugely important role as an educator. in Greenwich Village and in New York City. And she actually, prior to marrying Garnett, she was a teacher living as a boarder at 50 West 13th Street, which is shown here on the middle of the screen, just outside of the bounds of the northern edge of the Greenwich Village Historic District. But thanks to research that Village Preservation did that determined that Sarah then Tompkins was a boarder of another prominent Black businessman named Jacob Day. Those two bits of information informed the Landmarks Preservation Commission into convincing them to designate 50 West 13th Street as an individual landmark. So we're very proud of being part of that. Sarah is a nice transition point into our next theme of transformational women, or transformative women. I realized that I was going to probably run out of time if I got too far into the transformative women map. And also I've already touched on some of these transformative women throughout other themes and will continue to do so in the next little while we have together. But I just wanted to, again, kind of illustrate just how many there are. And as really is the case with every single one of these thematic maps, there's so much more we could add. Like we could probably have 1,000 sites on each of these or on many of them. And so as I always say about most of Village Preservation's virtual maps and resources, I think of this as a living document and we're always updating it and adding more. But at any rate, here is just kind of a snapshot of some of the women. I'm sure there are names that you recognize here: Eleanor Roosevelt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who founded the Whitney Museum of American Art, Jane Jacobs, our beloved local preservationist. And then just thinking about the top and the bottom of this alphabetical list, Amelia Earhart is all the way at the top, who you can't see in this little snapshot. And then all the way at the bottom is Willa Cather. So yes, many, many transformative women. And I really encourage you to take a closer look at this layer of the map. Moving on to Jewish history. And one of the reasons I did it in this order is that one of our transformative women is coming up next. So Emma Lazarus, a transformative woman and a Jewish woman, is highlighted here, having lived at 18 West 10th Street. So the mansions seen here along West 10th Street were built in the 1850s during this kind of prolific time of mansion building in the neighborhood. And in 1883, number 18 was purchased by a Sephardic Jewish merchant named Moses Lazarus. His daughter, Emma, was the fourth of his 7 children. And she was born on July 22nd, 1849, and actually ended up being a lifelong villager. She wrote poetry speaking out against anti-Semitism, and she organized relief efforts for thousands of Jewish immigrants entering the US. And because of this, and related to her long history as a poet, she became best known for her poem, The New Colossus, which currently graces the Statue of Liberty. A couple other among the many Jewish residents of Greenwich Village over the years include 2 politicians, and again, of many politicians, both local and nationally significant, who have lived in Greenwich Village. So Fiorello LaGuardia lived at 39 Charles Street. He was New York City's first Jewish mayor. His mother was Jewish. He was also the first 3-term mayor. Another well-known Greenwich Village and New York City mayor was Ed Koch, who lived in a few different buildings in the village, one of them being 2 Fifth Avenue, and then another one here. You can see the interior of his kitchen. He served as mayor from 1978 to 1989, following terms as Greenwich Village's congressman, city council member, and Democratic district leader. So long history of being involved in the politics of Greenwich Village. One more layer of Jewish history that I wanted to have a chance to mention tonight is the Second Cemetery. This is something that, even growing up in the neighborhood as a Jewish person, I didn't know this until I started working at Village Preservation. Temple She'arith Israel. It was the first Jewish congregation in the United States, and it was also the only Jewish congregation in all of New York City from 1654 to 1825, during which time all practicing Jews therefore belonged to this one congregation. So therefore, they needed a cemetery. The congregation was founded by 23 Jews of mostly Spanish and Portuguese origin. And they had a cemetery plot further downtown. But in 1805, a plot was established here in the village when the synagogue's original cemetery in Lower Manhattan had been filled to capacity. So they put the second one here. And what remains today is, as you can see maybe in this small photograph, is a small triangular section of what had been a much larger cemetery. It is still owned by the same congregation, though they now practice on the Upper West Side. So on our whirlwind tour this evening, I just have a couple more themes to talk to you about. And we've already discussed how many creative people wrote movies and plays while living here in the village. But of course, also many movies and TV shows were filmed in the village or based on the village, and plays as well. So there are many, and you can explore, and this is one of the maps that I'm very certain is not comprehensive. There are a lot more that I notice throughout my life that I think, oh, we should add them to the map. But for now, I'll focus on a couple. So famously, the characters of Friends lived in Monica's apartment was in the village. Her grandmother's rent stabilized, or I think it was actually rent controlled, fictional address of 495 Grove Street. But the real address is 90 Bedford Street, and you may recognize it. And then, of course, Sex and the City also has many ties to the village, one being that the main character herself as a real person lives in the village with her husband, Matthew Broderick. They live in the West Village, but Magnolia Bakery during the cupcake craze of the early 2000s became even more famous when Sex and the City did a scene there. And then Carrie Bradshaw's apartment is also nearby, even though I think in the TV show she's supposed to live on the Upper East Side, but the actual stoop that you always see her exiting from is in the village. I also wanted to touch on most charming spots, and perhaps a little bit like the course of history change that I started with. It's somewhat subjective. Course of history change is in that many things can be thought of as the course of history changing, but in terms of most charming spots, it's more that, you know, who decides what the most charming spots are and how do you determine them? Though I'm sure we can all agree that in the village there are many. And so my disclaimer on this particular tour is that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the map was created in 2019. I've only been at Village Preservation for 3 years now, almost 3 years. So I was not involved in the choosing of which spots are the most charming. And of course, everybody will have a different answer. But I do find many of the spots on the tour to be charming. And I wanted to highlight a couple of them tonight. So starting with Washington Mews, I thought kind of similarly to Patchen Place, it's one of those really special, almost alleyways that don't really exist in other parts of Manhattan and is really special and unique to Greenwich Village. So this is just one of those charming, there's a few of them around the neighborhood, charming little back alley type streets. The term mews is not inaccurate, but it's a little bit of a misnomer here because it refers to the assumed fact that these quaint, low 1 to 2 story buildings that you see were constructed as stables for the fine mansions along the streets above and below it that they back. And while this is true, some of these were built as stables for the mansions. Some of the buildings were actually originally built a little bit later to start out as automobile garages. And yet others were actually purpose built as apartments. Most of these are apartments for NYU housing right now, but even originally, some of these were built as apartments, but they were just built to kind of mimic the stable look and give the impression that they could have been stables, so that the whole Muse has kind of a similar feeling to it. I also think Washington Muse is special for being one of those somewhat rare streets in the city and in the village that retains its cobblestone, or the technical term is Belgian block pavers here. And we have more, I guess, in kind of like the meatpacking district and the West Village. There are a few, but there aren't that many streets remaining that have that. Excuse me. The last stop that I wanted to point out on my whirlwind tour this evening is the Jefferson Market Library, because, well, it's my favorite building in Greenwich Village. And so even though it's large and I don't know, maybe charming and quaint go together, but I think it's one of the most charming spots for sure in our neighborhood. And it has a very long history, many layers of history that I won't have time for right now, but I'm sure many of you know some of this history, and I encourage you to read up more about it on our map. But the building was originally constructed in 1874 to 77 by Frederick Clark Withers and Calvert Vaux, who, along with Frederick Law Olmsted, designed Central Park and Prospect Park and others. The building is considered one of the finest examples of high Victorian architecture in America. And it really stands out as special and different among the lower row houses nearby. It was built originally as a courthouse. The Women's House of Detention next door, you can see in the 60s, was still there, now the location of the Jefferson Market Garden. And it was, the tower later was used as a fire watch lookout. The building has served as a police academy. It was semi-abandoned for years. And then ultimately it was saved and converted into a public library, a branch of the New York Public Library. And it was one of the city's early preservation victories. And so to me, that was kind of a lovely way to bookend, no pun intended, this tour that I've given, because I started with Washington Square Park closing to cars. And similarly, Jefferson Market was saved by community preservationists, or people who probably didn't even think of themselves as preservationists at the time. But there we go. They rallied to save the building, and it was one of the big preservation successes in New York City. To me, that's kind of a poetic aspect to our neighborhood, that we have these kind of different touch points that were the early preservation movement. And actually, Preservationists' Homes is another thematic tour that I didn't have time to delve into tonight, but is on our map. So to see more, this link here, the written out link, will take you to all of our maps, including this one and the Fifth Avenue one that I mentioned, and dozens of others. But if you scan the QR code here, that will take you directly to the map that I've been showing you this evening, to the Greenwich Village Historic District map. So I can come back to that in a moment if more people want to have the chance to scan that QR code. But just for a couple of minutes before I wrap up here, I wanted to go back to the then and now map and then open it up to questions. So maybe I'll just really quickly go back to the original so you can remind yourselves of how to access all of this information, because I really want everybody to be able to experience this for themselves and dive deeper than we've had the chance to tonight. So here you can see all of the different themes, and whichever one you feel like clicking on, like say Preservationists' Homes, as I was just talking about, you can click on Jane Jacobs' face there and it'll take you directly to the Preservationists' Homes map. And this is how each tour looks. You can kind of scan through and then click on any of them to learn more. And while you're in here, you can also click through and access any of the thematic tours from within the map. And then I will just land on the then and now photos. which has a little bit of a different look to it because our wonderful associate, Chloe, who is becoming a GIS expert, has figured out how to do this map so that you can see every footprint of every building so that you can really zoom in as much as you want, figure out exactly what building you're interested in, and then click on it and see a few interesting details. So you get the then and now photos for every building. And there's also a direct link to the designation report, which I won't click on now because it's a huge volume, but it has more details about the architectural history of every single building. So I think I will pause there for now, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, let me just echo what everyone is saying in the chat, Dena, that this was an absolutely awesome presentation. And I think your whirlwind tour did some justice, but because otherwise we would be here for hours and hours, and we just get an appreciation what of an incredible neighborhood we get to work in. All right, so folks, yes, please go ahead and pop in your questions into the Q&A, but we already have a few in here, so we'll just go ahead and get started. So Ted is asking, when did the last car go through Washington Square Park?
It was, I believe, 1958. And I do have a note of that here so I can double check and tell you for absolute certain. Yes. So that photograph that I showed of Claire and Stanley driving through the park was taken in 1958. And they were the kind of representative last car, but all cars ceased after that.
Gosh, that's still really late. I never knew. 1958, my goodness. All right, we have another question here. Why is the western border of the district Washington Street rather than West Street?
That is a really great and somewhat complicated question. So there was, I believe, initially the proposal put forth to protect Greenwich Village as a historic district did include all the way up to West Street. But the Landmarks Preservation Commission at the time, when they designated the district, decided to designate sort of a subset of what was initially proposed. Since then, village preservation has actually succeeded in achieving designation for portions of the West Village, which is known now officially as the Greenwich Village Historic District Extension. And so, yeah, we were very proud to get some protections there. There's still more to be done. There are still portions of the west and southern bits of Greenwich Village that don't have landmark protections, but much more do now than the initial 1969 designation.
And then when you were showing the image of the district's oldest standing building, the brick wall is exposed, and Lynn would like to know, why was that part of the siding left exposed to the brick?
So I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that originally the entire house was wood framed, and that was in the turn of the century, 1799 or so, when it was built. It wasn't until the 1830s that brickwork was introduced to the building. At that time, I'm actually not exactly sure whether it's how it looks now or if there probably were some further alterations, because it doesn't quite look 1830s to me anymore. And I would have to do a little bit more digging to see if we have any older photographs. It's a little tough with these buildings because there's no, photo documentation until the late 1800s. So sometimes you don't know exactly what took place, though we have other archival materials that can sometimes help us. But yeah, the building you see now is certainly not the very original version, though original elements are still extant.
What else? I don't know how much we can answer this question, but is there a limit on NYU in terms how much they can purchase in the neighborhood?
Ooh, I think that's a question that I'm a little scared to answer because I don't want to get it wrong. And I know that village preservation certainly and others have a long history of kind of figuring out what NYU should or could do around here. But I mean, yeah. So I guess I'll leave it at that. I don't really have an exact answer for that, though. I will say they've probably already purchased a lot of what we hope they would want too. We don't want them to take over the whole neighborhood, though they have some pretty good holdings here already.
And this one, here they're asking about plaques, realizing putting buildings of historic interest, huge job. Um, but a site of the birth of the Almanac Singers, Woody Guthrie and Pete
Ooh.
Seeger on West 10th Street, just off Greenwich Ave. What would it take to memorialize that?
That's a great site that we definitely have represented within our maps and resources. And I would say, just kind of a blanket statement, one of the main ways that village preservation is fighting to protect all of these layers of history is in these resources that we create, because there's, in certain ways, there's only so much we can do when it's a private home or something, in terms of impacting what happens at these buildings, even though all of them have certain level of protection being part of the historic district. But village preservation, what we can do is tell these stories. And so we're telling the stories through our digital resources, through programs such as this, in all different ways. And another way that perhaps is touched upon in this question is our plaque program. So definitely reach out to us for that particular building, or if you have other buildings that you think are deserving of plaques. We certainly have a long running list. I mean, pretty much any of these 1,000 or more sites that are represented on this tour, on these tours, could be worthy of plaque representation. And we've already put plaques on some of them. But anyway, it's kind of complicated how plaques ultimately get installed, because it does depend on whether, if it's a private building, the owner has to buy in, things like that. But we work with neighbors all around the district to get plaques installed periodically. And at this point in time, we're doing one, I think, twice a year, pretty much every 6 months. We have a new plaque going up to tell these stories in the real life places where they took place.
And you pointed out in the map, I thought it was really, really cool that you can zoom in to like the individual buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about the work that goes into, as this one, where you were updating the map, or some of the other maps that you've worked on, some of the research and technical
Mm-hmm.
aspects of creating these maps?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm sure you can imagine, there's so much that goes into it, and it really always is a team effort. So as I mentioned a couple times earlier, our research and preservation associate, Chloe, is kind of our resident GIS, and GIS is the digital mapping system that's used to map these buildings and get the footprints laid out on the digital map. She's the one who's doing kind of that piece of it. She and I together are doing a lot of the archival research. So as you saw on this particular map, we have the then and now photos, which are mostly the landmarks designation photo from the 60s, and then photos taken by our staff in 2019 and some more recently. But for a lot of these maps, and I very briefly showed it, there was one 1940s tax photo that I showed tonight for one of the churches on Fifth Avenue. And so we use older photographs like that, 1940s, sometimes even earlier. We have some really great, the New York Public Library has some great resources from the early 1900s that we use to kind of study the architectural changes that have happened over time. So that's a lot of the work that I do, to figure out what's the same and what's different, and how do we tell the story of how buildings have changed over time, either in their use or certain details on the facades and things like that. But yeah, lots of research, often over many months, goes into then building out these maps.
And no, incredible amount of work, and both you and Chloe do an amazing job. So folks, go out, check those maps. So enjoy them, use them, take
Yeah.
advantage of them, and all the great work that Dena and Chloe have done. And then we have I think this may be our last question of the evening, but can a similar map be created about the buildings that are no longer in existence, like the 10th Street Studios?
I love that question. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to understand what buildings are gone, what have taken their place, what did this neighborhood look like at a certain point in time, where we actually have a lot of buildings, from say the mid 1800s that are still standing today, but then there are all these individual locations where those buildings have been replaced, and can we create kind of a vision of what the entire streetscape looked like at that point in time. So that's my romanticizing my job, but we do we have a few maps already that try to do some work to illustrate such things. And actually, in the case of the 10th Street Studios, our artists' homes and haunts map on this Greenwich Village Historic District map and tours does include 10th Street Studios, and in some other select instances does include buildings that are no longer extant, that were just so integral to the history of these places that we found they need to be included even if they're no longer there. But for the most part, this particular map is meant to show buildings that are still standing, or at least were in the 1960s, so we can see that comparison of what's happened since the district was designated. But we have other resources that talk about buildings that are no longer with us. And another example I mentioned tonight is our bicentennial of Fifth Avenue map. The kind of the whole intention of that map was to show what did that avenue look like at every point in time. So we show every single building that ever was built along Lower Fifth Avenue up from Washington Square North to 14th Street, including all of the ones that are gone and what they were replaced with. So we certainly do a lot of research to understand what buildings have been lost, and then we're always looking at different ways to represent that information for the public to get to understand it too.
Thank you again, Dena. Just going to echo all the comments from folks that this was an absolutely awesome presentation. So thank you for all the work that you do and sharing that time and wisdom with us here this evening. And thank you to all of you for attending this evening's program. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us here at Village Preservation. Please head over to villagepreservation.org. Check out these maps, all these fabulous resources that are free to you to access, whether you do decide to become a member or not. But we do hope that you do eventually decide to become a Village Preservation member. You get first dibs on registration for our programs, and we also do members only programming as well. But thank you again. Thank you, Dena. Stay warm, everyone, and we'll see you at the next program. Take care and have a great night.
Good night, everyone.